Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be discussing a topic that isn't covered in the textbook. So this chapter is on group processes, and I wanted to discuss something that is very relevant to group processes, but doesn't perhaps fall within the purview of the textbook chapter. So I'm going to be roping in concepts from the chapter to introduce in the context of today's topic, but I won't be doing my typical direct explication of textbook content. My hope is that you will find this topic unique and interesting, as it's probably not a topic that you'd encounter in nearly any psychology class. So we're going to discuss something that I have a very strong personal interest in, and sort of a kind of a small, tenuous research interest in, which is new religious movements, or, as they're known in popular parlance, cults. So this lecture will serve as an addendum to the textbook chapter as we apply some of the concepts from the group processes chapter and some other chapters and sort of psychology in general to this unique topic. So, by the end of this lecture, hopefully you will know a little bit more about new religious movements. You'll know sort of the definition of a cult or a new religious movement and what the sort of, not distinction between the two is, but why we use these two different terms or what the two different terms mean. You'll know a little bit more about the study of new religious movements, how we can actually research them, and the unique kind of challenges and angles and aspects of this kind of research. And you'll know a little bit about the role of group processes in new religious movements. Specifically, how does things like motivation and emotion affect membership in new religious movements? And what psychological research on group processes can tell us about the leaders of these movements. And then finally, we'll go over some recent examples of new religious movements that I think are of great sort of psychological interest and, general popular interest. Okay, let's get to it. So, we probably all have an intuitive understanding of what a cult is. We're familiar with them from, fictional depictions, and we also likely know of some ones that exist in the real world. But it turns out that defining what a cult is actually pretty difficult. In fact, I bet that we could all probably agree on a general definition of cults. If we were, in a classroom right now, we could probably all come to a pretty easy agreement of what a cult is, but I bet some of us would actually disagree over which groups count as cults. So, for example, is Scientology a cult? Most people would probably say yes, but some in the class probably would disagree. Some of you who are watching the lecture now might be, disagreeing with that. Or to take an even more controversial example, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormon Church or the Mormonism, right? Is that a cult? Some people do think so, but of course many do not. And, there are many members of this church, and I'm sure that they don't think of it as a cult. So as you can see, applying the term is a very tricky thing. And this is partly because no group would ever self-define or self-identify themselves as a cult, of course, right? Because the term is a pejorative. It has a clear negative connotation. It's associated with things like brainwashing and emotional manipulation and suicide and violence and a variety of other criminal activities. And so in order to avoid the trickiness of that word, the literature on this kind of thing uses the term new religious movement. And this is helpful because it's a more accurate description of the groups that we're interested in, and it removes the negative connotation that I just described. And it also actually removes a lot of the disagreements over which groups qualify for this term. So to revisit our examples that I just brought up, both Scientology and Mormonism are comfortably categorized as new religious movements. This is not a controversial thing to call either Scientology or Mormonism a new religious movement. In fact, it's sort of definitively or patently true. And so that helps to kind of reduce that controversy or sort of like negative sort of connotation. And it helps to kind of describe instead what we're actually what we're interested in studying, which is to say, these sorts of new religious-oriented groups that have emerged in the modern era. But one other advantage of this term, new religious movement, is that it can illustrate a principle of research kind of in general, or broadly speaking. And that's that we should not be judgmental or prejudiced in our research. So the people who conduct this research, I'm not one of them, to be clear. I don't actually study this kind of thing. But the people who do, they should not go into their studies assuming that the participants of their studies are crazy or damaged or dangerous or stupid or anything else, right? And by using a term like cult, they would betray a prejudice against these people and the processes that they're trying to understand. And instead, researchers should try to treat their subjects, the subjects of their study, with respect, with integrity, right? And this is an important principle to uphold no matter what you're studying. So, for the sake of this lecture, I will probably interchangeably use the terms cult and new religious movement, or NRM for short. I'll try to stick to new religious movements. But, sometimes I definitely will say cult, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. And this is for comprehensibility that I'm going to kind of use both these terms, but it's also because I don't study this phenomenon. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of instances of great harm. And so for people like us, like you and I, who are not primary investigators of this phenomenon, I don't actually think terms like cult are as harmful. In fact, I think that lay usage of the term cult can be kind of helpful in a way, and that if the term new religious movement were used in public, or sort of like by the lay folk, this could actually be damaging in that it could whitewash very dangerous groups. That like dangerous groups that deserve the title of cult, right? So my responsibilities as a psychology lecturer and as a person who's otherwise uninvolved, like with this research or with sort of new religious movements in general, those responsibilities are different from those of a researcher of these things. And my responsibility here is to convey information accurately and to teach you all something, and that's what I'm going to try to do. It's not necessarily my responsibility to remain objective, let's say, or remain unprejudiced in the case of religious groups. So hopefully that'll make sense. If you have any questions about that kind of ethical bit or sort of our duties. My cat has some things to say, I think, about this topic. If you have any questions about all that, feel free to email me. But let's get into the topic itself. Okay, so new religious movements are religiously oriented groups that have emerged in the modern era. And this could include like a loosely affiliated group of disciples of an internet guru, like the followers of Teal Swan, who I'll mention again very briefly later, or a massive multinational, multi-billion-dollar business like Scientology. And they tend to be characterized by experimental membership, people just testing the waters, kind of joining for a brief time to see how they like it. So they affiliate with the group temporarily, and then they quickly disaffiliate entirely. So the majority of people who get involved with new religious movements in some way follow this trajectory. But despite this fact, many new religious movements call themselves the fastest growing religious movement on Earth. This claim is almost like a joke at this point, because it's made by so many different religious groups, and basically none of them can provide any real like evidence or data backing up this claim. They just say, millions joining each day or whatever, right? But these sorts of claims are usually based on the fact that most people who get involved spend a very small amount of time affiliating with the movement before detaching entirely. And so these people are likely counted as active members. And that helps to kind of bolster the farcical claim of like massive membership that so many of these groups make, when, probably all they did was come to a single meeting or take a single course or sign up for an email newsletter or take a pamphlet or buy a book or, whatever the case may be, right? Sorry, he's got a lot to say. I'm not sure if you can all hear him. Okay, Lucifer, that's enough. So, technically speaking, new religious movements have very little relevance for most people, lay people, academic people. They're like a relatively small force in society. That said, as you all know, they're of very high interest for lay folk, and they're also of high interest for researchers. For the public and popular media, cults are probably of interest because of their uniqueness as a human phenomenon. Like, people getting together to behave in very unusual ways. They often have beliefs and practices that seem very outlandish to outsiders. And they're also highly associated with, a lot of different scandalous topics like mass suicide, mass murder, brainwashing, mind control, kidnapping, sexual abuse, child abuse, polygamy, weapons hoarding, all sorts of sort of scandalous and kind of like sometimes frightening topics, right? In practice, only a small number of these new religious movements actually engage in these sorts of things, if at all. Brainwashing, I'll talk a little bit about later, but that, probably is not a real thing. That's probably a sort of a fabrication. At least there doesn't seem to be a lot of hard evidence that something like brainwashing can exist. But nonetheless, the enduring association of these concepts with new religious movements remains, thanks probably to the salience of historical examples, like the mass suicide of Heaven's Gate, or the mass suicide and homicide of Jonestown. And then for academics, the interest is also due to its uniqueness as a human phenomenon and behavior. So, although like new religious movements are kind of popularly thought of as simply like bad religions, they're sort of like these deceptive and dangerous grifts preying on people who are vulnerable. Academics try to understand them like as they are on their own terms. So one paper that I read recently in preparing for this lecture highlights that new religious movements are an example of the resilience of religious beliefs in the face of cultural and academic claims of the triumph of secularization. And this paper continues, rather than ask what is wrong with new religious movements, scholars have tried to assess what they mean in society. And so, in this way, the people who actually study these things are not as interested in them as sort of like vehicles for criminal activity or, mass abuse or mass death. Undoubtedly, those are aspects of it that are important to understand it or to study if relevant. But academics, I think, are more interested in this sort of like basic psychological and behavioral kind of phenomena associated with new religious movements, as opposed to just the kind of like flashy bits, let's say. So, for the scholars that actually do study new religious movements, what do you think they're most interested in? What sorts of topics do you all think they study? If we were in the classroom, I would ask for you to all generate examples, but instead just take a second, try to take the perspective of the researcher interested in studying new religious movements. I just kind of told you what they're interested in, right? Remember to remove that prejudice and that feeling of judgment. What questions would you want to answer so that you could share them with the scholarly community? So yeah, just take a second, think of a couple research questions that you might have. So obviously, there's sort of nigh on infinite questions that could be answered here. I'm going to list some of the things discussed across the literature, and I've probably covered some of the questions that you all thought of, but I bet not all of them. There's a massive range of worthwhile research questions here. So I'm sure that, some of you have thought of things that I didn't list here and that, haven't been studied, in fact, because, there's still many, many things that have never been studied in this work. But, basically you might want to study what is a new religious movement. How do you define them? How do you distinguish them from old traditional religious movements? What unites them? What distinguishes them from one another, right? These sorts of things. What accounts for increases and decreases in their popularity? In other words, why are they sometimes a much larger and more impactful element of a society, and why do they sometimes kind of fall away? Why are they more popular in some cultures than others, or some countries than others? And what is it about a society or a culture that changes, that encourages or discourages new religious movements? Because if we understand that, we might understand something fundamental about new religious movements themselves, about their appeal or their sort of purpose or their utility, right? How and why do they recruit people? We actually will talk a little bit about this today. But, this can tell us something about the appeal of new religious movements, the motivations that are associated with people who join them, like what purpose can they serve for the people that end up joining them, who joins and leaves and why, what makes someone join, but also what causes them to leave or disaffiliate with the group, and what is it that changes, or what is it about that original purpose that they were serving that they can no longer serve, this sort of thing, right? How do people who become members of new religious movements differ from those who never become members of this sort of thing or aren't susceptible to joining these groups? How do these people who do join change over time? What does it do for them? Are there positive effects? Are there negative effects? Do they differ in some way over time by as a result of joining and participating in these groups? How do these groups relate to society in general, but also the family and friends of the members? So we'll also talk about this a little bit today. But how are they? How do they treat people who aren't part of the group? Let's say. And how do the people who are outside of the group view these movements? Do they perceive them positively or negatively, or sort of with neutrality and like broad tolerance? And what accounts for these views? What leads some of these groups to be accepted in some countries and cultures and outright rejected in other countries and cultures? And I actually have a firm example of this that will come up right at the end of this lecture. So I think what's notable about many of these topics is their relationship to more kind of basic group processes that are discussed in the first lecture today and also in the textbook chapter. And obviously we can't really discuss all of these topics, or really even any of them, in great detail. This is a brand new topic for you all, so I can't really go too deep into it. And frankly, I'm also not an expert on this. This is sort of like a pet interest of mine. But my goal here is just to kind of introduce you all to the broad ideas of research into new religious movements, and introduce you to sort of how we can apply the basic principles of group processes in order to get some insight into this kind of like complex and unique applied topic. And obviously there are other, similarly complicated and unique applications of group processes. This is just the one that I thought is kind of fun, hopefully for you all. What I will say is that these topics tend to be very difficult to study. There's not that many people involved in these groups, and they tend to be secretive, or at the very least cagey towards outsiders. They're usually very suspicious of authority figures and academics, possibly for good reason. And new religious movements also differ widely between one another. So studying one of them is not the same thing as studying all of them. Individual experiences with new religious movements differ between groups, between people, across time. So, someone might dabble in Scientology for years, kind of going to the occasional course or buying the occasional book, without ever fully giving up their life to the church. On the other hand, there are members of Scientology who sign a billion-year contract to Scientology's paramilitary group, Sea Org. I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. The contract is for 1 billion years. So these members give up their property, their money, their basic human rights, basically, for the church in order to join this paramilitary group that's part of the church called Sea Org. So clearly these two sets of people have different experiences. And these experiences likely also vary widely across time. Many of those Sea Org members started off as dabblers in the church, I'm sure. So all of these factors make it difficult to make sweeping statements about new religious movements. Anytime you try to make a claim about what they are or what they do, how they affect their members, how their members behave, or what their personalities are like, you can just be met with a counterexample. So we have to be very careful in studying them and in making claims about them. So, having pointed out how difficult it is to study these groups and how we have to be careful about the claims we make about them, let's talk a little bit about what has been studied. So a kind of popular anecdotal view of members of new religious movements is that they're lonely, bored, confused, they're kind of feeling empty, looking for something more. And this is kind of what makes them susceptible and kind of vulnerable to recruitment into these groups. And this is somewhat backed up by research. So one study found that current members of new religious movements show insecure pasts, difficult relationships, depressive tendencies, high need for closure, that kind of thing. But currently, remember these are current members of groups, they actually showed fairly positive current mental states and actually had optimism for the future. They showed relatively normal mood, secure relationships, so on, that sort of thing, right? And it is worth noting that was a study of only one new religious movement, so it doesn't necessarily characterize all of them, which again, this is kind of the difficulty here. But it does potentially tell us something about how and why people join these groups. It may be that people who want to kind of create meaning in their lives are most susceptible to joining these groups. They want to create meaning by forming stable relationships, identifying a stable group of connections, creating reliable and stable habits and behaviors and beliefs. And all of these things can kind of help to impose meaning and structure for people who might feel that they're lacking those things. So this helps to kind of reduce uncertainty, and it helps to make them feel more effective, more valuable, more loved. And these are all really important basic human motivations. And they're also important functions of groups, as discussed in a chapter. And recruitment methods may also be explained by appealing to these same motivations. So, for example, the Children of God cult, they're currently known as the Family, but used to be, or were originally called the Children of God. They infamously used a tactic for recruitment called flirty fishing. So flirty fishing is where they would have young, attractive women from the group seduce men as a means of initiating them into the group. They'd go kind of cruising downtown and kind of just like pick up guys and bring them back or whatever. And by offering those men, affection and intimacy, they were probably targeting like lonely men. They're able to kind of entice them into at least considering joining the group, right? There's a similar tactic known as love bombing, which was practiced by the Children of God that I just mentioned, but also the Moonies, or the Unification Church, I believe it's called. And so this is heaping like praise and affection onto potential initiates in order to make them feel welcome and desired and valued and cherished and all those other nice things, right? You're sort of appealing to that need in these people in order to entice them or encourage them to join your group. Scientology, which I've talked about a little bit already, takes a different tack when trying to entice new members. So if you live in Toronto, you might have seen them before on the streets trying to convince people to take a free personality test. And these personality tests, or, quote unquote personality tests, I should say, because of course they're complete nonsense. They're bullshit, right? But they use these measures, let's say, or questionnaires is a good word for it. They use it to probe for what parts of your life are like unsatisfactory, or how you might feel empty or emotionally unstable in some way. And then they basically just promise that in exchange for, great quantities of money, of course, they can help you fix all these things. And so in this case, they're appealing to your need to feel competent and effective, and they're using that to motivate you to join their group. So basically, they're promising that joining their group will satisfy basically all of your motivations and basic psychological needs, because it'll make you feel emotionally stable and more productive and smarter and more competent and more effective and so on and so forth, right? I mean, it's all fake. but this is the sort of thing that they're appealing to when they try to recruit new members. But ultimately, what new religious movements offer often in order to entice new members and to keep them around is what's called affective bonding. And this basically means that they want to provide you with new in-group ties that will gradually overpower or replace your ex and out-group ties, your family and friends. And doing this over time will discourage disaffiliation. If you're able to successfully do this to your members, then they basically will feel that they don't have anyone else outside of the group. And so even if they want to leave, it makes it difficult to even conceive of it, because there's no one to escape to, right? And there's no one kind of offering you that hand to help pull you out. This is one of the strongest and most common forms of recruitment and retention. And in particular, it's strongly associated with Scientology, which encourages its members to cut off family and friends who are not part of Scientology. They call these people suppressive persons, or SPs. And notably, this is a major component in like what's popularly called brainwashing. I made reference to this earlier, but I'm going to say kind of explicitly that brainwashing is it's primarily a fictional concept that has minimal evidence or like scholarly recognition. People obviously, of course, can be highly persuaded and manipulated. No one disputes this, right? That this is a big part of cults or new religious movements, is kind of doing this persuasion and manipulation and kind of like changing of people, right? But the idea that there's like a replicable way to kind of systematically replace someone's personality is broadly disputed by experts. But I will say that, in a lot of ex-cult members' testimonials, when they describe the process of trying to leave whatever group it is and to be de-radicalized, they do basically report this exact thing. They say that they wanted to leave for a long time, but there was no one left to leave to, because they had cut off everyone they knew, and the only people they knew were in the group. And sometimes that means your spouse and your children and all of your friends, right? And you don't have any family left outside of the group, and even your spouse and children want to stay in the group, so you can't leave. There's a lot of stories of that kind of thing. So this kind of affective bonding is arguably the best way to keep someone yours for forever. And that might be the true kind of like quote unquote brainwashing, if anything like that exists. But despite all these appeals to group processes and emotional experiences and psychological motivations, when we're kind of like explaining why people join and stay in new religious movements, generally these groups like kind of resist generalization. The psychological experiences of the members of these new religious movements, their behavior, their beliefs, their emotions, or the suppression of their emotions, whatever. All of these things vary drastically from group to group and from person to person. So it's tough to say a lot, sort of generally about all of them. And what makes it even more complicated from a research perspective is considering the point of view for all of these things. So when you collect this kind of information, you have to ask who is interpreting these various experiences. Is it the subjects themselves? Is it, during the sort of membership in the group or afterwards? Is it an outsider from the group, or is it the researcher themselves, or is it the leader of the group, right? Because depending on who's describing these experiences, it's tough to know how we as researchers should interpret them. Are they genuine? Are they coerced? Are they just kind of like putting on a show for us, or are they being honest? Are they even being honest with themselves, right? It's tough to know. And studying these sorts of like real messy experiences it's always difficult, but it's especially difficult in cases where deceit is likely. We kind of know deceit is a major operator in these kinds of groups. And the subjects in these cases probably implicitly mistrust the researchers. So this really limits the strength of any conclusion that a researcher can make when studying new religious movements. And, that doesn't mean we shouldn't study them, and it doesn't mean that we haven't found, interesting things while researching them. We certainly have. It just means that we need to be particularly careful in what we say about them and how we interpret our own work. And, although we kind of popularly think of cults as being negative and abusive, and they often are, I want to be clear, they often are, and we're going to talk about it. This isn't always the case. So, for example, members of the Hare Krishna, you might be familiar with this group, they don't report better or worse well-being than the general population. Even though they do report, according to our psychological measures, they do report higher delusional thinking and delusional convictions. So, I guess what I'm getting at is like, no cult story is simple. They all are packed with nuance, and they resist like simple reduction into the simple story of like bad person caused dumb people to behave poorly. That's never the story. It's never, maybe in like movies, in probably bad movies, right? That's the story. But in real life, things are never that simple. And in fact, if you look more deeply into these, the people who join them are almost never, rubes, right? They're almost never like dumb. In fact, highly educated and successful people are often kind of enticed into joining these groups. And there are some instances where there's not really any evidence that the leaders of these groups are bad people. Sometimes they definitely are, but not always. And sometimes the groups don't even really behave poorly. Sometimes they don't really ever do anything bad. It's just kind of the ones that do bad things that we hear about and talk about. So, I think we need to remember that not all new religious movements are the same, and so we shouldn't pretend that they are or treat them like they are, and we should avoid making any kind of sweeping generalizations, even once we have data and actual psychological research on them. So one thing that we haven't really discussed much is the actual leaders of these new religious movements. So we all kind of know that cults are often based in the charisma and the kind of compellingness of its leader, or at least that's like the popular portrayal, right? But here too, there are aspects of group processes that we can use to kind of gain insight into what makes a new religious movement leader effective and compelling. So research has shown us that the most effective leaders are the ones who can identify and address the needs of their followers. But of course, needs vary wildly between groups and between contexts. So we've identified different types of leaders that are best suited to serve certain needs. And to be clear, these are leaders in general, not necessarily like cult leaders. So charismatic leaders inspire their followers. They make them kind of like more active and enthusiastic, more convinced of their own greatness and kind of like capable of like bold action. Task-oriented leaders focus on achieving the group's goals and kind of keeping them motivated and making sure they're like effective and good at what they're doing and making progress. And relationship-oriented leaders focus on increasing and maintaining group harmony in relationships, kind of encouraging people to engage meaningfully with the group and kind of engage like equally, like or with equality in the group. And not every leader is necessarily like one of these at any given time, or even necessarily like only one of these. Instead, what we're kind of saying is that like these are types of leadership that can be effective. But there's an argument to be made that these types of leadership describe cult leaders and can tell us a little bit about how they're so successful. So, for example, Shoko Asahara, the founder of the Japanese cult Om Shinrikyo, he might fall into the charismatic leader category. So we're going to talk about Om Shinrikyo in greater detail momentarily. But basically, they felt that they were the chosen few who would inherit the earth after like the world ended and humanity was broadly eradicated, or like the unworthy among humanity was eradicated. So he inspired this group so profoundly that he was able to convince them to carry out a massive terrorist attack, which, like I said, I'll describe a little bit later. But T and Do, who were the two leaders of the cult Heaven's Gate, they might fall more into the like relationship oriented leader category. So they tried to create a group that was like wholly invested in itself, that acted in harmony and equality and kind of like worked together. At least that was their stated goal. I mean, we're also going to talk about them in greater detail, and you can make your own kind of judgment on that. But they were much more kind of invested in this like harmonious and sort of egalitarian group, more than most cults at least. And some of the abuses of cult leaders are also, I think, well explained by these group processes that we have in psychology. So past work has shown that when leaders, like again, leaders generally speaking, not necessarily cult leaders, when leaders have a high degree of power, it allows them to act with impunity. In other words, they're not worried about getting punished for anything they do or any repercussions of their actions. The high power allows them to feel psychologically distanced from the low power members of the group. And the high amount of power allows them to have like lowered compassion, basically, like lower empathy towards the other members of the group. And so many cults end up developing these sorts of harmful abuses of power over time. And they can include activities like, sexual abuse of both children and adults, like in David Koresh's Branch Davidians or in The Children of God. But arguably, there's no more extreme example of an abuse of power than the Jonestown Massacre, in which, many of you are probably familiar with this or have heard of Jonestown. We're not actually going to talk about them in great detail today because as a cult, to me, they're not actually the most interesting cult, but they do have kind of the most tragic ending. But basically, a cult leader named Jim Jones coerced or forced the suicide of over 900 individuals. So he had the members of this group drink Flavor Aid. Flavor Aid is like a knockoff of Kool-Aid. Drink Flavor Aid lined with cyanide in order to commit suicide. So this is where the phrase "drink the Kool-Aid" comes from. Some of you have probably heard this phrase before, but it means to like commit thoughtlessly to a group or to an ideology. So drink the Kool-Aid refers to, drinking the poison knowingly, right? So many of the people, like quote unquote, willingly submitted themselves to this and did commit suicide on Jones's command. But all of it was recorded on audio tapes. You can look it up and listen to it. And there's very clear evidence that many of them were forced to drink the poison, including quite a lot of children. So this is like the most extreme abuse of power, like imaginable, probably. And it's these kinds of basic psychological processes that allow leaders to commit these sorts of abuses. I mean, it's not the only thing, right? But you can understand how we can apply these basic principles of leadership and power to these very grand scales to understand them a little bit more, right? And so it's this high degree of power. It allows you to kind of act like you're God because no one can touch you or punish you. It makes you feel distant and distinct from the members of your group, which allows you to feel less empathy, less compassion, less similarity to them, meaning you don't really care what happens to them or if you abuse them. And that's it's a small snapshot or small insight into the psychology of cult leaders, I guess. So, throughout this lecture, I've made reference to a whole bunch of different new religious movements. Some of them you've probably heard of, others maybe you haven't. Depends on, I guess, your interest in this kind of thing. And there's maybe a dozen or maybe more new religious movements that I could talk about for hours. And if you want that, then you can just find me in BSB someday and corner me and ask me about it, and I'll talk your ear off about it. But for now, I'm just going to finish off this lecture by giving you a quick kind of very brief whirlwind tour of some notable cults and their kind of general operations and their kind of psychological relevance and their kind of impact that they had on society or continue to have. And first, we're going to talk about Aum Shinrikyo, which I referenced earlier. Aum Shinrikyo are a doomsday cult. Founded in Japan by a man who, he wasn't born with this name, but he changed his name eventually to Shoko Asahara. So this photo on the right is of Asahara. So he claims that it's a photo of him levitating, and he distributed it to science fiction magazines early in the group's life, basically saying, like, look what I'm capable of. Now, he's not levitating. As best people can tell, he was basically doing this pose and had powerful legs, and so he was jumping up in the air kind of while in this pose, and then they took a quick photo of him basically. But he was able to kind of use it to popularize himself as a guru, as a kind of magician almost. This group blends together elements from a wide variety of religions, but with a focus on Christianity and Buddhism. And Asahara kind of frames himself as like the Messiah and the next coming of Christ for the group. This is a pattern you're going to hear all about, a lot of people who call themselves the next coming of Christ. But he convinced his followers that the world was soon going to end, and basically only his followers would be spared and they'd be left to inherit the earth. This is also a pattern. A lot of people feel this way about their respective groups. And so Aum end up carrying out a number of assassinations and terrorist attacks. but it culminates and kind of ends, sort of, in their greatest crime, which was the Tokyo subway attacks of 1995. And so in this event, members of OM released a poison gas called sarin gas into the subway. And basically they did it during rush hour, and a bunch of them planned it so that they would be at like key choke points of the Tokyo subway system, and they brought these plastic bags filled with sarin gas onto the trains, and they would drop the gas and then use an umbrella that they had sharpened on the end to stab the bag on the ground, and then just kind of leave it so that it would leak gas into the trains, into the platforms during rush hour. What ended up happening was it injured thousands of people, and it killed 13. And it, like, thankfully they had actually botched the formula for this poison, so it wasn't as potent as it could have been. And I believe they also botched certain aspects of the execution of this plan. But if it had gone kind of correctly, let's say, or it had gone according to the original plan, they would have killed thousands, many thousands. Because the goal was to incite World War III. Basically, they wanted to bring about World War III so that they could, like, bring on the doomsday scenario that Asahara had prophesied and promised. But after the attack, they were, caught, basically. And Asahara and many others were arrested and imprisoned until 2018, when they were actually executed for their crimes and killed by hanging. So the group itself actually still exists to this day, but no longer with Asahara, obviously. And I don't think that they've been accused of, like, committing any similar crimes. I think they've been fairly quiet. And I think they might have actually split up into a couple of splinter groups that all still exist. And I think the main one is called Aleph now. But I don't think they're nearly as active, and they're probably not nearly as troublesome anymore. So next we're going to talk about Heaven's Gate. Many of you have likely heard of Heaven's Gate before. They're a group who believe that basically the earth would soon be recycled, and that their only chance for survival and salvation was to escape on the Hale-Bopp comet. This was a comet that passed by the earth in the 90s. And when the comet passed by the earth in March, I believe, of 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate committed suicide. They didn't think that they were committing suicide. Basically, they were leaving their vehicles, their what they considered to be their bodily vehicles, so that their souls could be transported to a flying spaceship that was hidden behind the Hale-Bopp comet. And this mass suicide, included in the 39 members, was one of the group's two leaders, Marshall Applewhite, also known as Doe. The group's other leader, Bonnie Nettles, had died from liver cancer in the 80s. She was known as T. So collectively there were T and Doe. Often you'll hear them referred to as that. And so the group actually left two members behind who volunteered to stay behind in order to continue to spread the word of Heaven's Gate. And they're called the Heaven's Gate Home Team. So these two individuals still maintain the Heaven's Gate website. Like, you should be able to go to the Heaven's Gate website right now. I went to it a few days ago. They still distribute videos and reading materials to the people who request them from the website. And they were called basically the Heaven's Gate Home Team, and then the people who left are the Heaven's Gate Away Team. So you might have seen images before. You can look this up if you're not sort of squirmy. Images of the people, the away team, the people who killed themselves, all wearing matching tracksuits and like Nike sneakers, and with blankets over their face and chest, lying in bunks. So they're all wearing these matching outfits, and you don't see anything. You basically just see images of their, like, you kind of see their tracksuits and their Nike sneakers. But they all had these matching outfits, and, you know, sort of passed away peacefully and quietly in their bunks, in the group's like compound or whatever. So I find Heaven's Gate so fascinating. I have since I was a teenager. And what's kind of most notable about them to me is the lack of coercion and abuse that's evident in the group. People who left the group before the mass suicide report that they were not pressured to stay, they weren't manipulated or coerced, and in fact, before the group's end, or you know, before the mass suicide, members were free to come and go and to contact their family and friends. And in fact, there were some people who decided that they didn't want to participate in this suicide, and they simply left, right? Writings from the people who did kill themselves from just before they died. There's like a guest book, I think it was, and there were journals and that sort of thing. They seem excited and proud and jubilant. And as far as any legitimate source can tell, the group committed suicide of their own free will. Even though they did have a leader who passed down these teachings, they weren't being like forced or tricked, I guess. I mean, the leader committed suicide too. He seemed to be the strongest believer of all, right? So people are quick to call this group and its leader, Marshall Applewhite, to call him evil. But I don't know, as far as I can tell, and as far as many people who have studied it can tell, they were just deluded, not abusive or manipulative or evil. The members seem to have died happy and of their own volition. I mean, they did commit suicide, and, you know, depending on your kind of like perspective on things, that may itself be a great moral crime, but they did it of their own choice, right? And they did it happy and peacefully. And so to say that their members were just like fooled or forced or coerced into suicide when there's no evidence to suggest that is kind of to just, I think it disrespects them in a way, and it posthumously kind of removes their agency, because we might not agree with their beliefs or their actions, but I think it's important that we don't conflate this event with something like Jonestown that I mentioned earlier, because we have proof that in the case of Jonestown, people were either sometimes killed or forced to commit suicide or coerced into it. And in fact, in Jonestown, and this is important as well, they were lied to in order to commit suicide. I won't get into the details, but basically Jim Jones lied to them that the United States were coming to attack them and kill them, the United States military. It's not important. My point is that the difference, I think, here is a matter of intentionality and coercion. And in the case of Heaven's Gate, the leader and the people all seem to truly believe in what they were doing. And in the case of Jonestown, you know, it was a much more sort of violent and aggressive affair based on outright deceit. He knew he was lying, right? Okay. Let's move on from that. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the Church of Scientology. So this was a religion created by a science fiction author named L. Ron Hubbard. So in 1948, Hubbard is quoted as saying, you don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, you start a religion. And so you can probably see where this is going. A few years later, he publishes a book that is called Dianetics. So this book constructs a sort of overly complex metaphysics of like the human mind and spirit, and it claims to have the secret to fixing all problems with health and emotions and productivity and relationships, whatever. You know, I could get into the details of that stuff. I know it for some reason, but it's not important. It's just pseudoscience and, you know, bullshit made up by some guy, right? So whatever. It's not important for you all to know right now. But he eventually founds a church based on these beliefs or fantasies or arguments or whatever, called the Church of Scientology. And so this church is most famous these days for its association with celebs, basically, like Tom Cruise and John Travolta. And it uses these people to kind of brand itself as like an attractive and successful sort of lifestyle almost. And the group offers its teachings in exchange for just, massive amounts of money. And they encourage their members to spend more and more time and money in the church. And, they kind of eventually recommend excommunicating all your friends and family who are not part of the cult. And they try to basically isolate their members from the outside world entirely. So they've been accused of extreme harassment and abuse of dissenters and ex-members, and historically they're extremely litigious towards anyone who speaks out against them. And the church has also been accused of extreme mental and physical abuse of its members, and it has also been accused of causing the deaths of several of its own members. So, although Scientology does have legal recognition as a religion in some countries, which does give it sort of a tax-free status, and that's what it allows it to make its untold amounts of profits and to kind of like swindle people without even paying tax, it is actually recognized as a cult in some other countries. So France, for example, convicted the church of fraud and fined them a massive amount of money a few years ago. But in any case, once you do spend the millions of dollars climbing the ranks of Scientology and sort of like learning all the various like pseudoscience that it's based on, you eventually learn its final secrets. And the final secrets are that a galactic overlord named Xenu killed billions of aliens or humans or, entities, basically killed billions of people 75 million years ago. And the souls of those dead entities now inhabit our bodies. And those souls are called thetans, and they cause us, mental anguish and relationship problems and health issues and whatever. And so through the secrets of Scientology, you can learn to extract these alien souls from your body and to fix these problems. So as you can probably tell, I've talked about these three groups now. I consider this to be one of the more troubling examples of cults in the contemporary era. This is the group of the three that is still actively harming people and shows no sign of slowing down, really. I think that this group engages in some of the most harmful and psychologically coercive and manipulative kind of tactics for recruitment and for maintaining members. And there's quite a lot of evidence out there to support that belief. So, I'm actually going to recommend one thing later on, in case you're interested. But there's plenty of it out there in case you are. So, really just Google it if you're curious. One website actually that you could read that's been around since the 90s is called Operation Clambake. So if you just Google Operation Clambake, you'll find a lot of material sort of on Scientology and their practices. Okay, so before I let you go, I just want to talk to you very quickly about the depiction of cults in popular media. I am a huge fan of like fiction and nonfiction about cults. I find it so fascinating. I think they make great storytelling vehicles. If you tell me that a movie is about a cult, I'll almost certainly watch it, even if it's just okay. And this is probably where my interest in cults began. I don't actually remember, but I probably saw some good cult movies or something when I was young, and I've been kind of hooked ever since. But I think we need to be very careful about media depictions of real life cults, even like nonfiction. Media depictions tend to be written by people who are fascinated with cults, but they're not necessarily concerned with like truth or like accurate depictions. And they're definitely not experts on the phenomenon of new religious movements and the sort of like intricacies and nuances of them. They're usually just kind of interested in like sensationalizing the topic in some way in order to make it compelling and entertaining for the audience. So it's totally okay to enjoy this sort of thing. I'm not saying don't engage with that media at all. I think we just need to be very skeptical of it. Even the ostensibly nonfiction media, even nonfiction media, does this kind of massaging of the truth, or sometimes outright misinformation. And I can actually provide some examples here. So these are kind of the anti-recommendations of media for you. You know, I often give you media recommendations at the end of the lecture. So here I'm going to give you sort of some warnings about media. So the first example is a podcast that came out a few years ago called Heaven's Gate. And I was really excited when I found out about this podcast. I listened to it as it was coming out because, as I mentioned, I'm so fascinated by Heaven's Gate and have been since I was very young. And this podcast basically tries to tell the story of Heaven's Gate back from its inception many decades ago, all the way to the mass suicide in the 90s and even up to today, because it talks to even some like ex-members or that sort of thing, like people who today still have some relationship in some way to the group. And the podcast has lots of interesting bits, like biographical information on its leaders and interviews with ex-members, some of whom actually regret not leaving with the OA team back in 1997, like regret not being there to kill themselves. But what this podcast does do is engage in really sensational speculation, misinformation, and outright just like deception. So the thing that I remember most that really bothered me was they interview an expert about the concept of brainwashing. And then the expert states, like, in no uncertain terms, there's no evidence for anything like brainwashing anywhere, even in Heaven's Gate. And then it kind of like goes back to the host, and he's sort of like, but what if they did brainwash, right? Like, you interview an expert for a reason, presumably, but then you just outright disagree with them and engage in wild, uninformed, baseless speculation. And similarly, there are surviving ex-members of the group that insist that they were free to do whatever they liked. They were not coerced by the group. They were, free to come and go as they pleased. But the podcast kind of insists, regardless of all that information, kind of insists that the cult was actually very coercive and manipulative and restrictive, but never provide any evidence of this. The best sort of evidence that they have is they talk to a grieving set of parents who missed their daughter because she died, basically. But that's not really evidence. That's just, sort of emotional manipulation of the audience, basically. And I think basically that was the goal. The writers of the podcast were just shocked and upset by this mass suicide. Understandably, of course, it is very shocking and upsetting. But they based their writing and their story around that emotional reaction rather than around the actual facts of the case. And the other example that I just wanted to talk about quickly of a kind of an inaccurate media representation of a real life cult is the television show Waco. So this show depicts the cult, the Branch Davidians, which is a Christian cult led by David Koresh, who also claimed to be the next coming of Christ. So this group ended up hoarding a lot of weapons, like rifles and what have you, and so they ended up embroiled in like a standoff with first the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and then later on the FBI. And so this siege by the FBI ended with the compound being burned down, and 79 Branch Davidians died. And David Koresh, the leader, was alleged to be, a physical and sexual abuser of children. He fathered children on at least one minor, had a child bride basically that who gave birth to his children, and that was only one of his many, many brides. And the show, for whatever reason, depicts Koresh very sympathetically and very positively, ignoring the evidence that he was actually a very violent and cruel man, and kind of like whitewashing his child abuse and the statutory rape that he engaged in. So I did actually find the show very entertaining and enjoyable. So in that regard, I kind of can recommend it. But I think it paints a very complimentary picture of this man who was alleged to have done some very heinous things. And at the very least, we know for a fact he was guilty of polygamy and of mass hoarding of firearms, which both seem morally wrong. So I don't think this should really be ignored in the media representations of David Koresh. I will say that the one thing, that the show does well, and some other media representations of Waco does well, is that it's highly critical of the American government and how they handled this situation, and they, correctly point out that that the FBI probably did cause the unnecessary deaths of all these Branch Davidians, that they didn't need to burn down the compound or whatever it was that happened, because to this day we don't really know who was shot by whom and how the place burnt down. But regardless, even if the FBI did kind of botch the handling of that siege, that doesn't mean David Koresh was a good person. So all of this is to say that when you engage with this kind of media, you should be critical, think for yourself, seek out other sources of information, look for expert and professional sources whenever possible, and avoid the ones that seem sensational or the ones that seem like invested in creating something shocking or entertaining just for the sake of it, because those voices are definitely out there and they can be enjoyable to engage with, but you can't take them at their word wholly. You have to cross-reference them with more tempered, informed voices. Okay. That's my kind of warning about information like this. Having said that, let me provide you some quick media recommendations about cults, and then we'll call it for the day. So the first thing I'll recommend is Louis Theroux's Weird Weekends. This was a series back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's not only about cults or new religious movements. It's about subcultures, let's say. And they do actually, or Louis Theroux, this gentleman on the left, does actually visit quite a few new religious movements, but he visits many other subcultures as well. Every episode of this show, for me at least, is amazing and compelling and interesting and charming. This host, Louis Theroux, is just excellent. I think he's such a good interviewer. He's such a natural interviewer, and he's such a strange man that it really helps to disarm people and to get them to engage with him authentically. And you'll learn a lot about a lot of different subcultures, some of them harmful, others just kooky. And yeah, this show's excellent. I recommend looking it up, and you can see on Wikipedia the kind of list of their episodes. So you could just even choose the topics you're interested in if there's like a cult one that you might be interested in. The next recommendation is the documentary Going Clear. So this is about Scientology. This documentary kind of lit the church on fire. It upset them deeply because it kind of aired out all their dirty laundry and told all their nasty secrets. I talked a lot about Scientology earlier. I don't need to talk about them more right now, I don't think, but you heard the things I said earlier. Basically, this documentary goes through a lot of it, and I think you'd find it very eye-opening. So I think it's worth watching. And for what it's worth, if you want more Scientology information, I mean, there's tons out there, but Louis Theroux, the gentleman that I just mentioned, also has a good documentary about Scientology called My Scientology Movie. That's what it's called. And that one's not quite as directly informative as Going Clear, but it is very illustrative, let's say. So I recommend both, but maybe Going Clear and then My Scientology Movie. Next is the nonfiction book Underground. This book is written by Haruki Murakami, a very beloved Japanese writer who mostly writes fiction. But he wrote this nonfiction book where he interviews people who were affected by the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system. So victims or people who worked for the subway, that sort of thing. So it's not about the cult itself, though it certainly gets into, talking about Om Shinrikyo and also talking about what Om's relevance was to Japanese culture. So I think this is a really interesting book. You might find it a little disappointing if you just want kind of raw information on Om Shinrikyo, but I just found it such a fascinating read to hear it kind of from the victims and bystanders perspective. And you do learn a little bit about Om Shinrikyo as well. And then finally, this is a podcast that I did consider to be really informative and enjoyable, called The Gateway. And this is about a kind of new online-centered cult led by this sort of self-styled guru named Teal Swan. It's very interesting. I don't know where that movement is headed, if it's gaining steam or if it's slowing down. But basically this sort of self-styled guru Teal Swan has been associated with quite a few suicides of her disciples, and this podcast kind of investigates that and investigates the phenomenon of online gurus in general. So I think it's very interesting. I think you'll enjoy it if you find this kind of thing enjoyable. Okay, so this is the end, basically. I've got my references. I used a bunch of materials, and a lot of it sort of I know off the top of my head, but I also was trying to engage with the literature in order to prepare this lecture. So I've got my references listed after this slide. You can see it in the slides if you just check the files if you're interested in learning more. But, I hope you found this enjoyable. I know this wasn't covered in the textbook, but my goal was to show you how to apply some of the textbook concepts and material to something real life, to something more kind of legitimate, or like something that exists in the world. So yeah, hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you found it enjoyable. Hopefully you learned a little something. If you didn't, well, don't worry about it. Probably no other course ever will teach you about cults. So you'll just have to worry about it for this one course, and then you can push it out of your mind. If you have any questions about any of this material, feel free to email me, and otherwise I'll see you next week.